Good afternoon. Thanks for signing up for today's webinar. So just to kick things off, a couple of housekeeping announcements before we start. We are recording today's webinar so that we can distribute it to those who can't be with us live today. So please make sure your microphone is on mute. And we're also going to be distributing a copy of the slides after the event. Now, I appreciate that everyone has very busy schedules just now, and especially competing priorities. So over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, I will be taking you through the recent trends and developments in life sciences deal making, and particularly in the wake of current circumstances, and how the industry, which has always operated on a global level, is adapting to what the new normal will be for the foreseeable future. My name is David Gallagher. I'm a partner in Brodie's commercial services team, specialising in international licensing deals within the life and chemical sciences sector. And prior to joining Brodie's, I co-founded a UK headquartered cell therapy company, and we raised $32 million of equity, partnering in grant finance, and entered into licensing arrangements with companies in Japan, the EU, and the United States. And because of the international reach of the sector, much of what we're going to discuss today will be in relation to a global context, but we will relate this back to Scottish and UK specific support where applicable. You can leave your comments and questions in the Q&A section below, and we will try to address as many of these as possible at the end of the webinar, in addition to the ones that have been very kindly provided in advance of today's session as well. You can post questions anonymously for the difficult ones ideally, or you can leave your name and company if you want name checked. So 2019 was a banner year for life sciences, with $350 billion worth of deals on a worldwide basis between mergers and acquisitions, licensing, and IPOs. Driven by increased life expectancy across the globe, the life science industry was on track to be worth over $10 trillion by 2022. That's according to Deloitte's latest Global Life Sciences Outlook. Now, this is driven by record healthcare spending by individual, which is estimated to be nearly $12,000 per person in the United States by 2022. And as large pharmaceutical companies battle with the loss of patent protection for their main revenue-generating drugs, research and development efforts have focused on moving novel medicines, whether it be traditional drugs, monoclonal antibodies, cell or gene therapies, into research pipelines to treat unmet need. And indeed, the traditional large pharmaceutical companies have not historically been geared up for the development of such novel therapeutics, and they've increasingly been outsourcing elements of their research pipeline to smaller, innovative companies via licensing and collaboration deals, and of course have been willing to pay a premium for exclusive rights once the risk of those early stage trials has been borne by the smaller risk-taking entities. Now, what this has done is that this has allowed these companies to raise substantial amounts of capital. In 2019, there were 7 IPOs of life science companies in the range of between $500 million and $1 billion in what's been described as the longest running bull market in history. It was a great time to be an entrepreneur in the life sciences space, and with an unprecedented amount of private capital to finance early stage development and record-breaking public listings once the sector had confidence in your product. Now, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and that's what we're going to turn to now. The COVID-19 pandemic has really seen the global economy completely grind to a halt. And while this is being most acutely felt in very visible sectors such as hospitality and retail, the life sciences sector has not been immune to the effects of social distancing. We've seen a number of immediate impacts, and it's really fundamentally changed the way in which companies do business. Now, none more so than companies who are at the cutting edge of life sciences research. And for an industry which thrives on collaboration and the close collegiate work of high-performing teams, the effects of social distancing have been absolutely devastating for the industry. And as a sector which is at the forefront of chemical and biological innovation, the life sciences sector across the globe has historically been very slow at adopting the latest digital technology. If you go on a tour of many of the most innovative companies in the sector, and you will see paper-based systems from quality control to regulatory teams, and even through to the basics such as holiday requests and staff performance tracking as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. You know, you're starting a life sciences company, and having raised investment, you want to ensure that as much of every pound or dollar as possible goes towards the mission of treating patients in whatever disease indication you're targeting. And getting a life sciences company, particularly in therapeutics or diagnostics, off the ground is really no easy feat at all. Now, often the digital infrastructure that underpins any organization seems like a luxury for the collaborative effort, which is absolutely fine for Silicon Valley biotech startups, but not necessarily for the plucky British equivalents who have always historically been underfunded in comparison to their West Coast cousins. Until that it's no longer a luxury, and these tools are absolutely critical to ensuring the business still operates and you can move forward with aims and objectives. Now, it's not just the procurement of these tools, it's the time that it takes to train staff and ensure that they're comfortable with using them and collaborating in a new way, as we are doing today. And every day that that's not the case, that loss is a sunk cost, particularly for a company that isn't generating any revenue. Now, the life sciences startup company path is well worn. Raise money, meet milestones, raise more money at a higher valuation, de-risk your product, line up an M&A transaction or an IPO to take your product to market. But only when that last hurdle is met will you be generating substantial revenue. Now, the current lockdown that we're all experiencing has exacerbated companies' financial worries, particularly due to the current situation, which is forcing most commercial labs to close their doors. And even as we've seen in recent days when the lockdown is eased, it's most likely that social distancing will be required to be maintained in some form for the foreseeable future. And particularly in Scotland, mandatory social distancing is in place for businesses, and that's enshrined in law via the emergency coronavirus legislation. And how will that be effective for your business that might be working in a tight lab space or reliant on a multi-person process? We've seen examples of companies proposing shift work to enable staff to return to work once restrictions are eased, or developing new standard operating procedures, which will allow businesses to maintain social distancing in a lab setting and environment. We've also seen several later stage clinical trials be delayed as a result of the pandemic as well. With borders closing, many companies that are running multinational clinical trials aren't able to ship product through their usual supply chain channels and get therapeutics cleared at customs. And even those routes that are still open are experiencing significant delays in clearance processes, primarily due to staff shortages. And that's a particular issue for cell therapies and gene therapies with very short shelf lives. And in terms of new clinical trials, those that are not COVID-19 related, we're hearing from those involved in industry that it's difficult to get those off the ground at the moment. Health services across the world are struggling to cope with the influx of COVID-19 related symptoms, and many hospitals across the world have suspended approval and enrolment of participants in new clinical trials, which are going to take some time to ramp up again once the pandemic is at a more manageable stage for health services and hospitals, not just in the UK, but across the world. Of course, many companies that operate in the life sciences space still have overheads to pay for. Rent being the largest, staff wages, business rates, tax payments, and other operating costs. And of course, many of these can be offset with government schemes, which I'll come on to talk about in a little while, but payments are still likely to be delayed, and that can lead to severe cash flow difficulties for companies, many of which are burning through investor cash with no income to speak of and no revenue. On the regulatory side, and indeed of particular interest to those who have joined today from a medical devices background, the EU's new medical device regulations implementation has been delayed. For those of you who are aware, the new regulations were designed to streamline and create an EU-wide standard primarily for the traceability and safety management of medical devices within the EU. Originally supposed to come into force on the 26th of May this year, its implementation has been pushed back by a year to May 2020 to relieve some of the burden on national authorities, manufacturers and other industry players who are now at the front line and refocusing efforts to fight COVID-19. Now, the problems that I've just mentioned are by no means an exhaustive list, but they're just some of the immediate impacts that we've seen as a result of COVID-19, and many of these are not unique to the life sciences sector. Many of the common issues with cross-sector applicability have been earmarked for support by the UK government, and that's what I want to talk about just now. So, the UK government announced its Future Fund last week, which aims to provide support for small and medium-sized businesses, and it's available to unlisted UK registered companies, subject to a few tests. They've got to have a substantive economic presence in the United Kingdom, and that test is about the size of their operations in the UK, rather than an actual assessment of the size of the company itself. They've got to show that they can attract enough funding from third-party investors to match the amount from the future fund. And at this stage, to us, from looking at the legislation, it's really not clear if the match funding must also be by way of a convertible loan. But what the guidance suggests is that the future fund and the matched investors would be going in on the same terms. And the company has to have raised at least a total of £250,000 worth of investment, equity investment from private third-party investors over the last 5 years. The Future Fund is designed to provide an initial £250 million of funding into UK startups that meet those criteria by way of co-investment. And as I mentioned, the funding from the Future Fund will still need to be matched by private investors. The mechanism for this is that the companies will be able to apply for convertible loans, and those will range from £125,000 up to £5 million. There's no maximum amount of funding which can be made by the private investors, but in terms of matching, it's subject to the maximum 5 million there as well. The scheme is going to be administered by the UK government in partnership with the British Business Bank, and the funding, which includes the match funding as well, has got to be used solely for working capital purposes. It can't be used for repayment of third-party borrowing, payment of dividends or bonus payments to staff, management, shareholders or consultants as well. In addition, the funding from the Future Fund cannot be used for advisor replacement fees or indeed bonuses to external advisors as well. It's not clear just now if businesses receiving funding through the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme will be prohibited from using the government and match funding for payment of employee wages, although personally I would find that unlikely. We're having a call tomorrow with stakeholders to find out more about that. And the government's not proposing to match private funding of previously closed rounds. So if your business wants to benefit from the Future Fund, then it's going to need to seek further private investment as well. If you are close to completing a funding round and you wish to apply for the match funding, then you might want to consider delaying closing your round until the scheme opens. Any repayment of the loan into the Future Fund is at the sole discretion of the government. And there's interest accrues at a rate of 8% per annum, and that's only payable on maturity of the loan unless a higher amount of interest is agreed with the investor who's matching the funds. What's expected is that the government will convert its loan into shares prior to the repayment date, and that's going to be a maximum of 36 months from the date of closing. There's an automatic mechanism for the loan to convert into shares on a qualifying funding round, which is a round that raises an amount at least equal to the government and match funding, and then it converts at a 20% discount to the price set by that funding round. So it's quite a neat mechanism. The company is then entitled to choose whether to repay the accrued interest that's accrued over the 6 months or allow it to convert, which also converts at the full price of that round as well. So from an investor perspective, it's expected that the Future Fund is going to require the loan to convert into the most senior class of shares in the company. So they will rank first in any capital distribution. And if there's a funding round in the first 6 months from the date of conversion, then the Future Fund will be entitled to convert its shares into any further senior class of shares issued at that fundraising. There's limited corporate governance rights, typical of kind of loan note holders during the term of the loan, and limited corporate governance rights, kind of typical of the shareholders. For example, consent rights or vetoes and decisions, which would have material impact on the Future Fund's investment. For example, a winding up of the company. There's limited warranties that are required to be given by the company at the closure of the loan. And it's also not clear at present if the Future Fund will also expect warranties to be given by the founders and executives of the company. These types of warranties will include things like title and ownership, capacity, compliance, borrowing, litigation, etc., and insolvency risk. Now, the company has to undertake that the Future Fund will be treated equally alongside other investors on purely commercial terms, and in particular, they require the same information rights as well. There will be a negative pledge, and that has the effect of preventing the creation of any debt which is senior to the loan provided by the Future Fund, unless that debt is from a genuine third party that's not an existing shareholder or investor. And if further convertible loan notes are issued on more favourable terms, then it's a right for the terms of the funding, including the matched funding, to be amended so that those more favourable terms also apply to the convertible loans held by the Future Fund and those who are matching it in this round. Now, while I would be absolutely delighted to be proved wrong, and to be honest, the commercial terms themselves are on the company-friendly side of market standard, I personally am still slightly sceptical about this scheme. It still requires match funding, and the proposed 125,000 to 5 million level is very similar to what SE have been doing north of the border for years. And certainly from my knowledge, in the current set of circumstances, there's less private capital which investors are deploying at the moment, particularly angels who have their own financial situation to worry about. And those that are deploying capital tend to be focusing on existing portfolio companies rather than new prospects, certainly from what I've been hearing from the industry in the market just now. In terms of the amount that's available, there's initially £250 million available, which, to be honest, I don't think is going to touch the sides of what the need is from UK companies, and also requires an investment history of at least £250,000 from external investors over the last 5 years. So it's not necessarily going to help new startups that have been using their own funds and bootstrapping to get investor ready and market ready. So the scheme seems really more applicable to scale-up companies that will burn through the available funds very, very quickly. Now, another UK government scheme to assist with the payment of wages for furloughed employees is the UK Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Now, we've all heard a lot about the scheme in the news and many webinars ever since late March, so I'm going to keep the basics short and we'll focus on some recent updates. So broadly, the scheme has been set up to reimburse 80%, up to £2,500 of salary for furloughed employees' wages. Any UK employer is eligible, so long as they have a PAYE scheme registered with HMRC prior to the 19th of March 2020 and have enrolled for PAYE online and have a UK bank account. Now, HMRC opened their portal on the 20th of April, but pay can be backdated to the 1st of March so long as the conditions of the scheme are met, and the money should be with the employer within 6 working days, and we've started to see the first payments come through for that now. HMRC have also noted that all VAT-registered businesses benefit from VAT payments being deferred for 3 months. That starts from the 20th of March 2020 until the 30th of June 2020, although VAT returns still have to be submitted on time. Refunds and repayments are still going to be processed by HMRC as usual. There's no need to apply for this, but if you pay by direct debit, you should need to cancel your direct debit or the VAT will still be collected. We would advise, cancelling direct debits as soon as possible if your company has the 31st March return date, but please do remember to reinstate the VAT payments after the 1st of July 2020. And you have until the end of the 2020-21 financial year to pay back the VAT that's been deferred. So in addition, the Scottish specific reliefs, including all non-domestic properties, getting a 1.6% rates relief for 2021, which effectively reverses the increase in poundage for the previously announced increases at the Scottish Budget 2020, and that's automatically applied by local authorities. Businesses can also get the Small Business Support Grant, and small businesses can apply for a one-off cash grant of around £10,000 if they're eligible for the Small Business Bonus Scheme relief or the Rural Relief, the latter more applicable to agricultural companies. For businesses operating out of multiple premises, you'll remember that the cash grant was initially a one-off grant to be paid to each business, regardless of the number of properties. However, on the 15th of April, the Scottish Government announced an extension to the Business Support Fund for additional premises. So if businesses are eligible for the full one-off £10,000, or in some cases £25,000 on their first properties above, they might be eligible for a further £7,500 grant or an £18,500 grant for each subsequent property. That brings the scheme in Scotland more in line with what the position is in England, where there is a full grant for each property that the businesses run from. Businesses should apply for grants on their local authority website by filling in the Coronavirus Business Support Fund form. Payments are being made within about 10 working days of receiving the form, and if your business has more than one premises, you'll be able to claim additional grants for your other premises from the 5th of May 2020. Another area which is proving helpful for businesses at present, and while not a COVID-19 specific relief, is HMRC's R&D tax credit scheme. It's always been a very valuable benefit for UK companies and provides a substantial amount of relief in pure cash terms, and provides a return of just over 33% for companies that make losses and they surrender those losses for cash. And given the cash constraints that many businesses in the sector are facing, it's worthwhile looking to see whether it's possible to bring forward the preparation of an R&D tax credit claim to improve cash flow, or to review existing claims to ensure all available spend has been captured. And in terms of leases and rent, Scotland's emergency coronavirus legislation set out protection for commercial tenants from termination of leases for non-payment of rent by increasing the notice period from 14 days to 14 weeks, which is subject to an extension by the Scottish Government. Importantly, however, it doesn't prevent landlords from serving notice on tenants for breaches that have nothing to do with money, and it also doesn't stop landlords from pursuing tenants by other means to recover rent arrears. So this should be treated with caution. And while all these government initiatives are welcome, there will be a massive economic rebuilding exercise to conduct once the pandemic has passed its peak. And what I wanted to talk about now was the green shoots of hope that have been emerging, and where business activity and deal making is likely to focus for the life sciences sector in the medium to longer term as we return to what will be a new normality. So you will have seen in the news that there are around 100 vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics currently undergoing development in the fight against COVID-19. And the normally guarded pharmaceutical industry, keen to protect its IP and shy of high-profile collaborations, has moved at an unprecedented speed, working globally to find a solution. Pharmaceutical companies have deep scientific knowledge gained from decades of experience with similar viruses, and companies are researching vaccine candidates and undertaking inventories of research portfolio libraries to identify additional potential treatments for R&D. Some have donated compounds with the potential to treat coronavirus for emergency use in clinical trials, including compounds formerly tested on other viral pathogens such as Ebola and HIV. Others are exploring ways to use their existing technologies that provide the ability to rapidly upscale production once a potential vaccine candidate has been identified. And prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were seeing an increased trend among big pharma to decentralize research and development efforts through licensing opportunities in order to have multiple shots on goal at different treatment approaches to various diseases. The speed and mobility with which the industry has moved gives me reasons for optimism that this behaviour will continue, and we will see greater global collaboration among the larger players and small companies specialising in therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics. It's clear from the government's message of trace and isolate that health monitoring to be key if a large force is to return to whatever normality look like, and wearable technology is going to be a large part of that return. Over in the UK, we're developing the NHS X app as a tracing solution to provide users with greater protection and an immediate awareness for those that they have come into contact with who might develop the virus. And while not a distinct wearable technology, it will get the public used to self-monitoring and a greater awareness of real-time health data that could well be integrated into widely adopted future technologies, including Apple Watches and Fitbits. And let's not forget that the government's primary aim from the beginning of this pandemic was to ensure that the NHS wasn't overwhelmed. Social distancing has seen the revolution of healthcare services, from pharmacies through to other primary carers, including GPs, providing consultation appointments remotely by video link. And the acceleration of adoption of such remote technologies, for example, ubiquitous acts like, such as Zoom that we are using today, and Microsoft Teams, will lead to the widespread adoption of more bespoke technologies in the longer term, as professionals realise that diagnosis can be conducted just as effectively in some circumstances, and patients realise the convenience factor as well. Now, before we talk about longer term trends, I want to talk about investment for a moment, because that is something that I've been hearing a lot about in the last few weeks, both good and bad. And I wanted to share my take on what's happening in the life sciences investment market at present, and for the purposes of this discussion. Now, I will exclude companies that are raising funds for the purposes of developing a treatment or vaccine for COVID-19, because money for that is freely available at the moment, and restricting that scope back to kind of business as usual investment. And we're still seeing deals being done globally in the UK and specifically in Scotland. The problem is with the yardstick that we use to measure that activity isn't necessarily fit for purpose anymore. Now, for deals that are closing now, I would probably anticipate that the first interaction that an investee company had with their new investor occurred probably at the latest around mid to late January. Now, if you remember those times, all we had to worry about was the incessant rain and getting Brexit done, as the saying went. And any investment is built on a relationship between the investor and the team that they're investing in. And throughout the entirety of my working life, I could count on one hand the number of investments that I've dealt with that concluded without the investor and management team meeting face to face. It's an absolute necessity. Now, fast forward to March, and most business travel had stopped by that point. Nobody was conducting face-to-face meetings, and air travel was drastically down. Those successful first meetings that would have taken place in early to mid-March would likely have seen deals concluding between June and September, depending on investment committee and approval processes that tend to vary from investor to investor. Now, it's easy for us lawyers sitting drafting investment agreements and licensing deals to say that deals are getting done, but ultimately it's not the full story. A chief exec will have been out pounding shoe leather at the JP Morgan conference in January and putting in FaceTime to get a deal over the line in March or April. For me, the acid test will come when we get into the summer months, and we simply don't have enough data just now to ascertain what deal flow will be like by that point. Now, if I was to make a prediction, I would suggest that deals will still be getting completed, but the process is likely to be much slower. There will be no facility visits, no meet the team events, and no impressing on investors with fine dining after a diligence meeting to assure them that your company is worth parting with their cash for. And that all leads to greater caution and a longer time to raising capital. But that's not to say that there's not capital to deploy. There is. Private equity funds and venture capitalists who are in the midst of deploying a fund, and they still have their funders to answer to, and they will be seeing attractive proposals in the market just now, particularly as the pandemic depresses valuations. And that's across sector. It's not just an issue that's unique to life sciences. Where we are seeing increased activity is with follow-on rounds from investors into existing portfolio companies who are raising capital to try and weather the storm. The team is known, the diligence is complete, and provided the business plan is still being executed, investors will be more comfortable putting their capital behind an existing prospect. Now, one area where we do anticipate a slowing of activity is the angel investment market, one that's been particularly strong for Scotland over the years, with a mature and sophisticated network of high net worth individuals, contributing usually between £250,000 and £2 million in early stage companies. And as with any seismic event, cash is proving to be king at the moment, and history tells us that those with greater capital reserves tend to weather the storm better in uncertain times, particularly when duration and exit strategy aren't certain. These individuals are independently wealthy and primarily use investment in early stage companies as a method of using the government's tax advantage EIS and SEIS schemes to offset tax liabilities. Now, it's very possible that a substantial portion of that capital could be redeployed elsewhere, which could leave companies looking to raise their first round of funding in a very tricky situation, as these amounts have historically been matched by the Scottish Investment Bank. New companies may be looking for founders, friends, and family to provide bootstrapping cash in greater quantities and indeed for longer than before. So before we take questions and wrap up, I wanted to spend 5 minutes or so just talking through what I see as trends that are likely to appear in the medium to longer term. So I'm talking likely through kind of 2021 and beyond here. And most companies that are performing research and development activities at the moment are experiencing some sort of delay for one reason or another, as we mentioned earlier on. Now, companies in the therapeutics space tend to rely on contract manufacturers to manufacture their products at scale. And when they get into the later stage clinical trials and eventually onto the market, it's foreseeable that due to the delays that we're experiencing just now, that will lead to a bottleneck in manufacturing capacity further down the line, as those with early stage programs compete for manufacturing slots with companies that have delayed later stage clinical trials. Now, manufacturing slots, as many of you will know, are already at a premium in certain areas such as viral vectors, with slots for small manufacturing runs regularly commanding upwards of £1.5 million. And if manufacturing capacity is likely to grow in line with what has been seen over the last 5 years, this is going to lead to a major squeeze for smaller companies, as large pharmaceutical companies with very strong cash positions who have the ability to block book slots on a retainer basis use up the available capacity. So it's either a very good time to get into the contract manufacturing business or build manufacturing into your business model, at least for early stage clinical trials. Now, the point that I made around collaboration is relevant here too. If a smaller company can hitch their wagon to one of the major players to sponsor development activity, it could really free up manufacturing space further down the line. But these thoughts will not be lost on large pharmaceutical companies as well, who could have an effective monopoly over late stage development that could depress valuations based on a net present value model, where an increased risk factor for manufacturing commercialization is priced in. And we've also seen early restrictions on exports of vital medicines and supplies, including PPE, as a result of COVID-19. Whether it be the United States requisitioning supplies of equipment from 3M that was destined for Canada, or the Czech government suspending export of vital medicines for 6 months, governments will be wary of their crown jewels in life sciences going to a foreign market to ensure that they are better prepared for any subsequent peak in infections or whatever unknown pathogen comes along next. This could be a major change to the way in which the life science industry operates. Historically, one which has thrived on globalization suddenly becoming hyper-localized within its home market. And of course, for governments to attract and keep companies in these shows, there will need to be suitable incentives for development. And that's something I would expect to hear more about, whether in the UK or otherwise, in the later part of the year. Scientific data publication is another topic which has accelerated dramatically during COVID-19. We're seeing the pre-publication of many papers prior to being formally peer-reviewed, and due to the unprecedented spread of the disease. I believe that because of this, we will end up seeing a marked shift away from the influence of traditional peer-reviewed publications, who've historically been very slow to publish data in favour of a rapid dissemination model, perhaps among specific scientific communities, which would provide a different method of peer review at that stage. And finally, the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence is beginning to show its usefulness in responding to the pandemic, which will leave the world better prepared to prepare for another crisis. And AI has already helped us to identify who's most at risk, to diagnose patients, to develop drugs faster, find existing drugs that can help. It's helped to predict the spread of the disease, to understand viruses better, map where the viruses come from, and to try and predict the next pandemic in the shape of that. Now, critics will argue that the response from some governments was too slow in the early stages of a disease, and such modelling, which has already helped in COVID-19 to identify at-risk groups, could help in future crisis scenarios as well. Now, much of what I've spoken about today in terms of the longer-term trends is clearly pure conjecture based on an educated guess, and having been around the industry in one shape or another for over 15 years. The reality is that nobody knows for certain what lies ahead, and nobody has lived through the long-term impact of a crisis that had such far-reaching global implications as COVID-19. What is clear is that the world will be a very different place for at least the next 12 to 18 months before we see any semblance of reality returning, or at least what we knew as reality in 2018, 2019. It's highly likely that we will see further consolidation within the industry as cash-rich companies buy up their weaker competitors at very attractive prices. And what will be important, certainly in my eyes, is that smaller economic ecosystems such as that we have in Scotland have a coordinated sector-wide approach to ensure that we can achieve all that we can and for the best possible outcome to try and weather this storm. So I'm conscious that I've now spoken for quite some time, and we have a question in the Q&A pane, which I'll do my best to answer just now. So I would recommend, if you have anything else to ask, please type away, and we'll try and get through as many as we can before we need to kind of wrap up in 5 minutes or so. Okay, so first question from an anonymous attendee is in relation to what we think the impact will be of the bounce back loan scheme that was announced by Rishi Sunak yesterday for life sciences businesses. So I'd imagine everyone probably watched the news yesterday. And the Chancellor announced that there would be small business loans provided, which would be up to a maximum of 25% of turnover, up to a maximum of £50,000. And the government would pay the interest on that for the first 12 months, and it's going to be 100% government backed. So this isn't like the small business loan scheme, which is only 80% government backed and 20% backed by the banks. This is 100% backed by the government. In terms of its applicability to life science businesses, most of the businesses that we speak to, and certainly most of the businesses within the sector, are very, cash hungry in terms of research and development. And a loan of £50,000, to my mind, and certainly in relation to a lot of companies within the sector, quite simply isn't going to touch the sides of what is actually required just now. That said, I think it's a move in the right direction by the government. I think what we were seeing in relation to the previous small business loan scheme was that while it was 80% backed by the government, it was still 20% backed by the banks, and the banks weren't willing to shoulder that risk. They were trying to pass that risk onto the end customer as well, whether that by way of personal guarantees, etc. And that did not prove particularly popular with many of the companies that we know within the SME sector at that point. So yes, I think that the scheme that was announced yesterday, in terms of its fundamentals, is very clear. It is good for business just because of the quantums that are available, and the maximum being £50,000. I'm not sure of its wider applicability to the life sciences sector in general. Okay, so we've got another question in here from Simon Hope at Savills. So, which are the strongest universities in Scotland for medicine and life sciences? Are there major hubs or campuses developing in the region? Yes, so in terms of strong, we're in a very fortunate position within Scotland that many of our higher education institutes produced excellent life science graduates and, do absolutely phenomenal research. That is partly as a result of, higher education within Scotland is very intertwined with industry, and industry bodies, we will talk to higher education institutes to allow them to shape their education in terms of providing employment at the end of it as well, and that in turn leads to trying to shape research as well. Thinking off the top of my head, that there does tend to be hubs. There's the Glasgow Biocorridor that stretches all the way from GlaxoSmithKline down in Irvine all the way across to BioCity at Newhouse, and that encompasses all of the higher education institutes within Glasgow as well. There is Edinburgh University, which is historically very good on life sciences, and there's an entire hub in Aberdeen as well. In terms of northeast development, and some fantastic companies have come out of all of these universities. St Andrews as well. I'm trying to think. Most of the universities have excellent life science facilities. In terms of responses to COVID-19, there are university labs who are prioritising treatments. You'll be aware of a press release that came out from TC Biopharm, where I used to work, in terms of their response and trying to repurpose some of their cell banks to treating COVID-19 patients as well. That was featured in the Scotsman and the Times a week ago on Sunday. There's a lot of activity going on within Scotland. But equally it feeds into the wider UK remit in terms of COVID-19 response as well. Okay, that was the two open questions that we had. So, it's got a thank you from Simon, no problem. If there are nothing further, I'll maybe hang on for another 30 seconds or so, just in case anyone's finishing typing. And if there's no further questions, then I think we can probably call it a day at that. So just to remind you that the webinar is being recorded. We're going to try and disseminate that to the people that couldn't join us today. And following on from that, we will also circulate a copy of the slides, which I'm conscious are quite minimal, but hopefully if you attended today, then that will be able to jog your memory. We are here, and my contact details are on the screen if you want to get in touch with me about anything further that I've spoken about today. So thank you very much for coming along. I appreciate everyone does have competing priorities and many different webinars and various things that they can attend to, in addition to juggling various responsibilities at home. So it's greatly appreciated that you have taken the time to come and hear me talk for the last 45 minutes or so. So thank you all very much for your time. Oh, there we go. So, I've got one question here, which is which of the COVID-19 vaccine trials has the best chance of success? I'm not necessarily sure if I'm the best qualified person to ask that. Being a lawyer and not a scientist. That said, we obviously do keep our pulse on the sector and on recent developments in the sector. And to my mind, that there are two that are kind of out in front. One is the vaccine from the University of Oxford that has undergone animal studies and is currently undergoing a very large safety trial just now based on a modified design. And that is looking very, very promising purely in terms of speed. And they were talking about getting the first 1 million doses, I think, out by September, should it prove efficacious. And the second vaccine that I think may well stand a very good chance is the one that's being developed by Moderna Therapeutics, who are based in Boston in the United States, which is an RNA-based vaccine, which also seems to be very, very promising and is backed by substantial amounts of capital. But again, I am not a scientist. I just keep a watching brief on these things. So I think that's all three questions that we've answered there. Thank you very much for your time. That's been greatly appreciated. And as I said, if you've got anything that you want to with after the event, my email address is on the screen, or it's on the Brody's website, as is my mobile number as well. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.